Hello. In this unit, we're going to talk about symbolization, and we're going to learn what symbolization is. And so we'll get into that by learning about what conditionals are. So let's remember the story we had in the airport. You're sitting in the airport, and you hear some people talking, and you overhear what they say. And you hear it's a couple, and the woman says to the man, "If you kiss me nicely, I will marry you." And you go, "Well, that's interesting." And you turn around because airports are often otherwise not exciting places, and he leans over and seems to kiss her nicely, and you conclude, she will marry him. So there are three sentences you might use to express your thoughts. You'd say, if he kisses her nicely, she will marry him. Maybe you think that sentence to yourself. You could say it out loud, which would be a little weird if there's no one else there. And you might think to yourself, he kissed her nicely. And the conclusion of your reasoning is, so she will marry him. So that first sentence is, if he kisses her nicely, she will marry him. This is an if-then sentence. Actually, we could put in a then between nicely and she will marry him. So it could be, if he kisses her nicely, then she will marry him. But we don't actually need the then. They say the same thing. And if-then sentences, and in fact just if sentences, are what we call conditionals, because the sentence doesn't flat out assert she will marry him. It says, on the condition that he kisses her nicely, she will marry him. It's saying that he kisses her nicely is a sufficient condition for her marrying him. So it's talking about one thing is true on the condition that another thing is true. If the one condition is met, his kiss is a nice one, then another condition will be met. She will marry him. So the if part of the conditional, in this case, he kisses her nicely, that's what we call the antecedent. And the then part of the conditional, in this case, she will marry him, that's what we call the consequent. So you're going to need to remember these three words. You may have heard them before, you may not have. You've probably almost certainly heard the word conditional before. You may not have heard the word antecedent or consequent before, but you'll need to get to know all three of these words. So you need to know what's a conditional. It's an if-then statement, or just an if statement. What's the antecedent? It's the statement in the if part. And what's the consequent? It's the then part, the other part. So just to have some brief practice with these terms. Say, if Quincy goes, then Sally goes. So what's the antecedent? The antecedent is the if part. In this case, Quincy goes is the if part. So the antecedent is Quincy goes. And the consequent is the remainder. It's the then part. It's Sally goes. How about, if Sally goes, Quincy goes? So again, the antecedent is the if part, and the if part is Sally goes. The consequent is the then part, the other part of the if sentence, and in this case, it's Quincy goes. So, and it's not, as we'll see later, it's not left to right necessarily, it's the if part. But so remember, what you need to remember for now is antecedent, if part, consequent, then part. So what we're going to talk about is translating arguments from English, or sentences, and hence arguments from English or any other natural language, a language that we speak, a language that wasn't intentionally created by humans, so Spanish or Mandarin or French or what have you, any language that wasn't intentionally created by humans, but in which we can sort of learn as a child. So any natural language, how to translate from a natural language that you understand. So in this case, we all understand English, from English into a language that makes the form of the initial sentence more obvious. So what are we doing? Well, we want to study reasoning, right? And in particular, we want to study validity. And so we're going to create another language. We're going to call it an artificial language or a symbolic language that makes whose sentences have obvious grammar and form. And we're going to translate English sentences into that other symbolic language. And that will make it easier to study validity. So that's what we're going to be doing. So how do we do that? Well, we'll start with learning how to symbolize conditionals. So the arrow will be our sign for a conditional sentence. If a sentence is built with an arrow, it's a conditional sentence. It's the equivalent of an if-then sentence. And so we have the sentence, if he kisses her nicely, she'll marry him, and we want to translate that into a sentence of this new language that we're just creating. Well, it would look like this. he kisses her nicely, arrow, she will marry him. So the antecedent goes before the arrow, and the consequent goes after the arrow. So, okay, we have this arrow, and the arrow is a different way of saying if-then. It basically goes where the then would go if there was a then. It goes between the antecedent and the consequent. So that's, I think, pretty straightforward. What we have is antecedent before consequent, and that's actually a way to help you remember which is the antecedent and which is the consequent. In the symbolic language, the antecedent comes before the consequent. The antecedent comes before the arrow, the consequent comes after the arrow. So what we've said so far as symbolizing conditionals, as far as translating them into our symbolic language, is that if he kisses her nicely, she will marry him. How do we symbolize that? Well, we put the antecedent, which is the if part, which is he kisses her nicely, on the left side of the arrow before the arrow, and we put the consequent, which is the then part, after the arrow. But as it turns out, this is an incomplete symbolization. How is it an incomplete symbolization? Well, we'll see that in the next video.